Okay, I think we can start while we carry on admitting people into the from the waiting room. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Wednesday seminar from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. Hope everybody is keeping safe as this lockdown progresses in different ways in different countries. I am very, very pleased to have scheduled this topic in. It's something we scheduled in March when we draw up the seminar timetable, and it's become more and more pertinent as we go along. We wanted to look at the emotional well-being of journalists at this incredibly trying time. I've written a lot about the attacks on press freedom, both before the COVID-19 pandemic, but also after. We feel that journalism is facing a unique set of challenges, and journalists are under extreme pressures at the moment. They're facing redundancy, ill health, and erosion of norms, and erosion of the kind of norms in which they operate, and also new waves of hostility from the public. This is something that's shared by much of the population, I know, but we also wanted to look at what is specifically unique to journalism and to see what can be done about it. And Professor Anthony Feinstein, he's a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto, is one of the world's leading experts on this topic. He has looked at how journalists covering major crises and events have been affected. He's looked at how they covered 9/11, the Balkans War. He has looked at the issue of moral injury, what happens when journalists operate under norms that they're uncomfortable in. And I'm really delighted that he agreed to come and speak to us today about the work we're doing and the work he's done in the past. We will keep this on the record, but I'm very aware it's a very sensitive topic. Do please type in questions along the chat function as we go along, and I will read them out. But we'll start in our normal way with Professor Feinstein speaking, and then I'll take questions from there. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Meera. Thank you for the introduction, and welcome everyone from Toronto. It's a hot and sticky day, so summer's arrived early, but we're still under lockdown, so the pandemic is still very much part of our society. I thought what I would do is speak about my research going back 20 years, because this is a period that I've devoted to looking at the emotional well-being of journalists. And I first became interested in the topic around about 1999, when a patient was referred to my clinic with a very unusual presentation. And to cut a long story short, she was a frontline journalist who had been working in East Africa. She had covered a lot of conflict. And over the years, she had become progressively distressed emotionally until she had this major breakdown, had to come back to Canada, and was referred to my clinic. And she did really well in therapy. She made a full recovery. And I remember saying to her at the time, you know, why had you not reached out for help earlier? You know, you worked for a large news organization. You knew that you were getting into trouble. Why did you not ask for assistance? And she said to me, you don't understand my profession. That if I had told my manager I was feeling this way, they would not have sent me out into the field again, and my career as a frontline correspondent would have been over. I remember this was 1999. This is going back 20 years. But I was intrigued by her response. I thought this was somewhat punitive. And so I asked my research team at the time, we were not involved with journalism research. I asked them to go and take some time and look at the literature and come back and tell me what had been published on the topic of journalists and trauma and emotional well-being. And they came back and said, we can't find a single paper. And I didn't believe them because, you know, in medicine, there's always someone who's been there before you. There's someone who's always written something before you on a particular topic. And so we went to the big library at the University of Toronto, which is a great library, and we asked the librarians to check and said, can you find us an article on this topic? And they came back and said, no, there's nothing there. So on the basis of that, I wrote a grant application and sent it to the Freedom Forum in Washington, DC. And remember, this was 1999. The world was in a much better place than it was now. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The economy was strong. The foundations had a lot of money. And it was the easiest grant that I ever got because the Freedom Forum wrote back and said, you know, this is really an interesting topic. We'd like to know how frontline journalists cope psychologically. Here's your grant. I have to tell you, I've never received another grant as easily as this. Kind of lulled me into a sense that this is really an easy topic to research, and it's absolutely not. Anyway, based on that early grant, we were able to undertake a study looking at frontline journalists who were working for the BBC, for CNN, for Reuters, Associated Press. I was given a Rolodex of 170 names of leading frontline journalists who basically defined their careers covering war and disaster and revolution. And we had a control group of journalists who had never done that, who'd stayed at home in Canada covering domestic news. And we had a look at topics like post-traumatic stress disorder, which I'll define for you, depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. Big ticket items when you're looking at trauma. And what we found, no surprise, in retrospect, no surprise, is that the group that went off to war had significantly more symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. So I want to quickly define PTSD for you, because people know that, they know the four letters that make up the word, but they don't fully understand what the condition is. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental illness that can arise in response to an overwhelming stress, a very significant major stress. That's the first point. This is not a minor event. The stress could have killed you, or you witnessed other people dying. And in response to that, you can develop symptoms that must fall into four categories. The first category refers to the re-experiencing or the intrusion of the traumatic event. So you have nightmares, or flashbacks, or unwanted recollections of the trauma. The second category is avoidance. So in response to this, you want to stay away from memories of the trauma. You make a conscious effort to avoid it. You try and block these thoughts out from your mind. You do not want to go back to the scene of where the traumatic event took place. So you've got to have the avoidance as well. The third symptom category refers to the arousal of your body's autonomic nervous system, which is now becoming hyper-aroused. You cannot fall asleep. You can't concentrate. You're irritable. You come back to a safe place like London or Toronto, but you still feel under threat. You're looking over your shoulder because you don't feel safe. And you have a prominent startle response. And the prominent startle response just reflects the degree to which your nervous system has been hyper-aroused. You just react excessively to things. And then the fourth symptom group, which was added recently, is that you look at the future with a sense of trepidation. You start worrying about the future. Rather than looking forward to something, you start anticipating future misfortune, almost like in a depressed way. So to have the diagnosis of PTSD, you have to have symptoms from all four groups. It's not enough for one group or two groups, all four groups. Plus, the symptoms have to be there for at least 4 weeks. And 4 weeks is an arbitrary cutoff point, but what the American Psychiatric Association is saying is that a lot of people who go through a major stress can have some of these symptoms for a day or two or a week or two, but in the majority of cases, it fades away. It's only when those symptoms persist for more than 4 weeks that you can start speaking about post-traumatic stress disorder. So you can see this is a very significant mental illness, and it can bring people down very hard. It's very treatable, as I'll speak about later. And so in this first study, in which we looked at the war journalists, 170 names from the news organizations, big news organizations. First observation was, our response rate was over 80%, which is very unusual in the social sciences. And this said to me that journalists actually wanted to talk about these kinds of experiences. And so they filled out a number of questionnaires. We looked at the PTSD profile, depression, etc. And we showed that symptoms were much more marked in the frontline journalists. We were able to show that their lifetime diagnosis, lifetime prevalence of diagnosis, so we go back over the entire lifetime and we tease out all these symptoms. And this allows us to come to a conclusion about what's their lifetime prevalence of PTSD. It's very close to what you find in frontline veteran soldiers. And so, this is a group, as you know, who confronts danger. They lead very dangerous lives. This was a group that had spent on average 15 years in war zones. I mean, think about that, 15 years in war zones. There is no other profession, I believe, that has such a lengthy exposure to war and trauma. Soldiers have a tour of duty, maybe 2, and they come home. But who spends 15 years or more in the world's worst places? Your profession does. And in response to that, over the course of all the years, the rates of post-traumatic stress disorder were actually quite high. Same thing for depression. Same thing for anxiety. And the other issue was individuals who feel emotionally distressed often self-medicate with alcohol. And we found quite high rates of alcohol consumption in this group. Now, the Canadian Medical Association says a man should not drink more than 14 drinks a week. And for a woman, it shouldn't be more than 9. And we found that in the frontline journalists, on average, they were drinking much more than that, both men and women. Certainly higher than the group that did domestic journalism. So we did this study, we published it in the American Journal of Psychiatry, and news organizations took note of it because they were part of the study, and very slowly they started to change their practices. I think too slowly. I thought that this would be the end of my involvement with journalists, But, the world is an infernal place and there's always more trouble lurking around the corner. And soon after we published this paper, the war in Iraq started, the 2003 war in Iraq. And my research group got a commission from two news organizations, CNN and ITN, to undertake a study looking at, whether embedded journalists, in other words, those journalists who are attached to military units, are they at greater risk for emotional difficulty, or is it protective to be part of the military? And so we did a study during the Iraq war. And we in fact showed early on that it made no difference. It didn't matter whether you were with the military or not, because the journalists who were not with the military were so creative in getting to the front lines. They were so inventive in ensuring that they were where they wanted to be, that their exposure to trauma was almost identical to the group who was attached to a military unit. The one stat that struck me as remarkable was we asked the journalists within the first 3 months of the war in Iraq to think back and tell us how many times they'd been exposed to an event that could have killed them. And the average in the first 3 months was about three events that in the space of such a short period of time could have killed them. Over the course of their career, that number is in excess of 20. So think about that. I mean, I think about my life and, hopefully you're never exposed to this once. But for journalists, this exposure to major stress, events that could have killed them, are part of what they do. And what we found with the Iraq war, it didn't matter whether you were an embedded journalist or a unilateral journalist, your exposure in the first few months of the war was the same, which meant that there were no differences between the two groups when it came to PTSD or depression or anxiety, because their exposure to the stressor was the same. So we did that study. We gave the data back to the news organizations, as we always do. And then the third commission that came our way was really quite fascinating. UNESCO came calling and said, we are worried about journalists who live and work in dangerous places. Up until now, my research was on Western journalists who fly into bad places and they stay 4 or 6 weeks, whatever, and then they come home. They rest and they go back. So they fly in and out. But the UNESCO question was a very different one, which was, what about journalists who live and work in dangerous places? And the example that they gave me was Mexico, because Mexican journalists covering the drug wars were leading very, very dangerous lives. And so we did a study. We did a study in Mexico looking at how Mexican journalists were coping emotionally with the challenges of covering the narco traffic in their country. And it soon became apparent to me that this was even more dangerous work because there was no respite. The journalists would do their work during the day, but in the evenings, they couldn't really put their feet up and relax because they were still in the front lines of trouble. And the drug lords knew that if they wanted to control the story, they had to control journalists. And so journalists in Mexico were getting hammered by very nasty people. And what the drug barons had learned to do to get to a journalist was not just to target the journalist, they were targeting their families, their parents, their children, their grandparents. And so the trauma that's visited on Mexican journalists, and I think one can extrapolate to many other countries in similar situations, is that there is no respite from the danger, no respite from the trauma. And what we found in the Mexican sample was that 1/4 of our sample surveyed had stopped working on a story because they were too traumatized to continue. So reflect on that. I mean, what does that say about your society when you have a media group that is so scared that they really cannot continue with what they're doing? 1/4 of the sample had stopped this. And we found that the biggest predictor of who would do this was the variable, your family. If your family was threatened, for some journalists, this was just one bridge too far for them. They stopped doing it. I was amazed by the courage of these journalists. If they were personally threatened, they kept doing it. But the moment the narco people went after their children or their parents, for 1/4 of our sample, that was too much, and they stopped doing it. So clearly a very troubling situation in Mexico, which I think is still ongoing, because what struck me about Mexico was that the message which had taken root in organizations like the BBC and Reuters and CNN that you've got to look after the emotional health of your journalists was simply not being followed in Mexico. There was no assistance, no help for these journalists. They were left to fend for themselves. Indeed, many news organizations made it clear that this wasn't an important topic for them. That if journalists spoke about this, the news organizations would become upset with them. In some organizations, there was even a culture of silence that management said, this is not for discussion in the newsroom. And so a very different way of dealing with this problem. Very, very different from what we see, for example, in Canada or the United Kingdom today. So just a few more reflections on some of the other research that we've done. I want to just focus on a couple other countries. You know, as I started to present my journalism data and audiences listened very carefully to it, during question time, there was a recurring theme. Why had we not done a study in Africa? Why had we always focused on Western media, et cetera, et cetera? And so with a good colleague of mine, John Owen, we went to Kenya and we did a study there. And we looked at two events in Kenyan society. One was the violence around the elections going back a decade. And the other one was the Al-Shabaab attack on journalists at the Westgate Mall. And no surprise, we showed that the journalists who were exposed to these traumas, particularly the election violence, had prominent symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and depression many years after the event because they hadn't received treatment. You know, this particular question was just not on the radar screen of news organizations in these countries. This wasn't considered an important topic. Yes, physical safety, there was some discussion about that. But when it came to emotional health, this was ignored. And what we found in Kenya was that many journalists were carrying the emotional scars of their work years after the election violence. The final country that I just want to touch on is Iran. I did a study in Iran with a colleague of mine, Maziar Bahari, who is an Iranian-Canadian journalist. And Maziar, in fact, had been incarcerated in Iran for 3 months after he went back to that country to visit his mother. So he had personal experience of how the regime in that country treats journalists. It was a difficult study to do because without Maziar's support, we would not have been able to collect data. You know, Iranian journalists weren't going to trust a researcher in Toronto. They wanted to have an Iranian partner. And so having Maziar on board was absolutely crucial. And what we found again, and this is going to come as no surprise, is that the regime is very harsh towards journalists who don't toe the party line. They harass them, they lock them up, they beat them, and just as in Mexico, they target their families as well. In fact, the level of trauma visited on Iranian journalists is extraordinary. And no surprise, in response to that, we found high rates of PTSD and depression once more. What was fascinating about the Iranian data was that those Iranian journalists who were traumatized had a tendency to self-medicate their distress. Now, we see this across multiple situations. We know that in society, people who are depressed, who are anxious or traumatized, can resort to things like alcohol to self-medicate. But in the Iranian, the country of Iran, which alcohol is not going to be something that's looked upon favorably, they were self-medicating in a different way. They were self-medicating with barbiturates. And barbiturates are a very, very old sedative. Barbiturates were available in the West prior to Valium. Once Valium came on the market, the barbiturates virtually disappeared because barbiturates are very dangerous drugs. They are highly addictive and, if taken in excessive quantities, are fatal. And what we saw, we could not have anticipated this, was that the Iranian journalists, who were traumatized, were resorting to barbiturates. And we asked ourselves, why barbiturates? I mean, this is an old drug. You know, these were the drugs that we used in the West in the 1950s, early 1960s. Why now? And we think that sanctions in Iran has hit the pharmaceutical industry in such a way that the older drugs are freely available, but it's more difficult to get the newer drugs. And so, journalists were getting their hands on medication that potentially is very dangerous, that we would not prescribe today, to try and dampen down their anxiety and their emotional distress. So what you can see from the studies that I've outlined so far is that there's a common theme. Expose people to trauma, hit them hard with violence. You will find a percentage of individuals developing incapacitating emotional difficulties, be it post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, or anxiety. If there's any good news in the story, it's this. News organizations are starting to change their tune. They're becoming much more receptive to looking after journalists, to helping them with their emotional well-being. And the other point is this: PTSD and depression and anxiety and substance abuse can be well treated. There are effective psychological therapies for these disorders. And so you don't want to have these symptoms go untreated and suffer because of that. And remember this, that if someone has PTSD, it doesn't just affect them. It affects their family, their children, their spouse. I mean, the knock-on effects of emotional trauma are considerable. What I've learned over time is that this can also play havoc with the newsroom. I'll give you an example. If you're a journalist in a far-flung place, say like Afghanistan, where there's a small bureau, and one of your colleagues is traumatized, and their behavior becomes erratic, and they're irritable, and their judgment is impaired, that's not just bad for the journalist, it's bad for the entire newsroom, for the bureau. That individual can compromise the safety of the colleagues. And so it's absolutely essential that news organizations pay proper attention to this question. There's this uncomfortable dichotomy between physical illness and mental illness. From where I sit, it's a false dichotomy. There is absolutely no difference. You know, if you break a leg, you wouldn't hesitate to go into the emergency room to get the leg mended, fixed. Why should it be different if you develop PTSD or depression or anxiety? It's exactly the same thing. Get it treated, because if you don't, the consequences can be significant. Before I conclude, I just want to touch on something which is not a mental illness, which I think is very relevant, particularly under the pandemic restrictions right now, and that's moral injury. And Meera mentioned it in the introduction. So moral injury is not a mental illness. You know, PTSD is, depression is, anxiety disorders are all mental illnesses. Substance abuse is a mental illness, but moral injury is not. And moral injury is that injury done to one's moral self by behavior, either your behavior or the behavior of other people, that transgresses your moral code of ethics. So you feel that somehow you've done something that might have compromised your own moral code of ethics, your own moral compass. But it can also come from witnessing other people's behavior as well. We speak about acts of commission, things that you might do that could lead to moral injury, and acts of omission, things that you should have done, but you never did. And I'll give you a classic example of moral injury in journalists. We all know the great war photographer, Don McCullin. And Don McCullin repeatedly speaks about the guilt that he feels at intruding into the lives of people who've endured great suffering. He says he's built a career on the backs of other people suffering. What he's giving expression to is a sense of moral injury, that somehow through his behavior, he's compromised his own moral compass. And moral injury is associated with two primary emotions, guilt and shame. And so McCullin speaks repeatedly about the guilt that he feels because of his work. Now, I think it's misplaced guilt. I mean, I think, you know, the challenge over here is for him to understand that this guilt is misplaced. But that said, for him, it's very real. And that's a powerful example of what moral injury is, that people feel that somehow through their behavior, they've compromised themselves morally, and because of that, they feel guilty or a sense of shame. And that, of course, can be very uncomfortable to live with. We see this now with the pandemic as well. In my profession, medicine, there's a fair bit of moral injury because doctors and nurses are being called on to make life and death decisions. You know, if you're in a crowded emergency room with a lot of people who've come down with the COVID virus, and you don't have enough equipment, who do you select to live? Who do you select who will not receive this? You know, prior to the pandemic, there was enough material to go around, enough resources to basically treat everyone. But the pandemic forced the medical profession into a sense of triage, having to make these life and death decisions. And for many, this is an acutely uncomfortable decision to make. And with it comes moral injury, a sense that we do not want to be the arbiters of life and death. We don't want to have to make these uncomfortable decisions like this. And if you feel somehow that you've made the wrong decision, or even if it's the right decision, but you feel your hand was forced, you can have a sense of moral injury and a sense of guilt and shame that comes with this. And this is certainly prevalent now within frontline medical staff. I also believe it's prevalent amongst journalists. we have to cover a very difficult story. And my experience of speaking to journalists who do this kind of work is that not infrequently, they are being asked by the general public to step outside their role of journalists and to provide assistance to them in different ways in which journalists are not trained to do. And when journalists refuse to do that, or they feel uncomfortable doing that, they have a sense somehow that they might have compromised themselves morally. And that's a short road to moral injury. So I think this is something that we still have to come to grips with. I think it's something that's not discussed enough in your profession, but moral injury is certainly very prevalent. In many ways, I think it's going to be a lot more common than something like post-traumatic stress disorder, just by the nature of what you work, the nature of the work you do. You're on the front lines and you're often called on to make very difficult choices that in theory could put you at risk for moral injury. So I've spoken for about half an hour. I'd like to stop now and open up for discussions and take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I listened kind of spellbound, actually. It was kind of unbelievable. It was very moving to hear, and I think everyone on the webinar felt the same. Do please type your questions into chat, and if you would like to speak, please just send me a message and I can unmute your microphone and speak. And we do have several questions. I'd like to start with one of my own, please, about the changing nature of the front line. So you started your research with what was very clearly a front line, a war zone, and then you expanded to the drug war in Mexico. And now the front line is a hospital, it's our communities. Yes. Do you think that it's the same impact on journalists? And related to that is, how do you feel the fact that so much is now online, so both in terms of the pressures of, you know, a 24-hour news cycle online, but also the trolling and the attacks journalists receive online? How much do you think that's feeding in to what you're seeing?
That's a great question. You know, when you look at the trauma literature, there's a divide. There's one group that says, we will define the severity of the trauma objectively. So there's a hierarchy of trauma. So for example, being in a war zone is more traumatic than being in a newsroom in Toronto, for example. One can readily understand that. But there's another school of trauma that says that's not so important. The important thing is, how does the individual perceive the trauma? Because people will perceive it differently. So I think we have to take the latter view into account, because there are journalists who don't go to war zones who can end up doing very traumatic work. An example for me is those journalists who are sitting in newsrooms all day long looking at user-generated content, looking at all this material that's streaming in from Syria, from Libya, etc., where you're viewing terrible, terrible images. This is what you have to do. That can be really traumatic work. And so the American Psychiatric Association recently, when they tweaked the criteria for PTSD, brought in the small print, a little point stating that if your work involves this kind of exposure, like secondhand exposure, as it were, to bad content, in theory, that's enough of a stress to trigger PTSD. Now, they made a point that that doesn't apply to the general public. So watching the news at night can't give you PTSD. But if this is your job, if this is your work, if you're stuck in a newsroom in Toronto, very safe city, but your job all day long is to screen, news from Syria, news from Iraq, news from Libya, this potentially can be enough of a stress to call PTSD. So we're seeing that what once upon a time was something far away from our homes, in a faraway country, is really on our doorstep right now. We're being exposed to this much more frequently, and that can become a trigger for PTSD. The moral injury question, I think, is applicable to our societies at home now. Absolutely. I think this is a major thing to consider during the pandemic, because there are so many moral issues raised by the pandemic and the way we responded to it.
Thank you. Do you feel that there's the kind of idea of a war correspondent, and you mentioned substance abuse, and the idea of journalists being hard drinkers is kind of mired in folklore, but the profile of a journalist is changing. There are younger journalists, there are kind of more women going out into the field, there are people from different cultures, there are more Muslim journalists where alcohol isn't the default release. Do you feel that the responses to kind of these traumatic events is different amongst different groups?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you're quite right. The woman question, I think, is fascinating, because when we started our studies 20 years back, the ratio of men to women was 3 to 1. 75% of our sample were men. Our more recent studies, the ratio is closer to 1-to-1 almost. So you see, you're right, you're seeing a lot more women do it. Now, if you step away from journalists, if you go into the society at large, a well-replicated finding is that depression and anxiety are much more frequent in women than in men. We've known this for decades. Now, the reasons are complex, and we're not going to go into them now. When you look at journalists, frontline journalists, and you look at the differences in sex response, you find that it's much the same. Yes, women are slightly more symptomatic than men, but not by a whole lot. So we're seeing something really interesting in frontline journalists, that the women who do this, and I believe it's a self-selection process over here, you know, going to war zones is not everybody's first choice when it comes to a profession. So the woman who chooses this kind of work, I think there's a self-selection involved. And with that comes a relative resilience to the kind of trauma that I've spoken about. So it's really quite a fascinating phenomenon. And you see it in the military as well. This is a select group of people who want to do it. Doesn't mean you're immune to PTSD or depression, no, but it means that the frequency with which you develop it is likely to be less. And that's really interesting. So it speaks about something innate within the person, which I think is part of the whole selection process of why they're attracted to this kind of work as well. So these are really complex behavioral manifestations.
It's really interesting. Look, go to the chat room for your questions. Thank you very much. And one from Isabel Bannerman, which is the kind of the general mood of the moment, which is this topic. It's very important, and it's still stigmatized. And the current pandemic in particular is very different because it's not a war zone. So
Yes.
how do you think the pressure of reporting at the moment is affecting journalists, especially since the tensions are running so high in both real life and online, and journalists are being attacked physically and online? And do you think institutions need to do more to support the journalists right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the first point is, you know, Meera is aware of this, and so am I. That's why we've launched a study right now looking at how journalists are coping with the pandemic. In my work with journalists over the last couple of months, I'm struck by a number of things. Number one, newsrooms are closed, so you're not going into the newsroom, so you're having to work from home. So that kind of camaraderie that was there with your colleagues is missing. And that's important because that's a good thing. You know, being there with your colleagues is supportive. There's a culture of the newsroom, which I think can be, you know, very healthy, and that's gone. So the social distancing and the pandemic restrictions have changed fundamentally the way you do your work. You're now having to work from home. That in itself can be very stressful when you're in a small home and you've got children running around and you're having to put in long hours and look after your children. That in itself is a very major stress as well. You know, the sessions that I've done with journalists working in Hong Kong really brings this home to me, because they're sitting in tiny apartments in high-rise buildings, you know, tiny 2-bedroom apartments with their children at home, their partners at home, and they're having to work very hard. So the actual work environment becomes a very major stress to them. And then, of course, the journalists who are doing the frontline work, who are there in the emergency rooms and the hospitals covering the pandemic, are witnessing at times very, very harrowing sights. I mean, the journalists who were in New York at the height of the infection rate, you know, were witnessing terrible scenes, very traumatic scenes. If you think of, you know, what defines the stress of PTSD, well, it's witnessing other people dying, or potentially you yourself could be placed in a position of becoming infected and dying. And so the stressor certainly qualifies for the stress of PTSD. And so for some journalists, PTSD becomes an issue. And then, of course, I spoke a bit about the whole moral injury question, which, you know, journalists are being called on to do things at times by the general public that fall outside journalism. You know, desperate people in the general public are reaching out to journalists. Can you help us find someone? Can you get us news with someone? Those kind of questions, which journalists are not trained to do. They're not trained to deal with this kind of distress. And, you know, if they make the wrong call, or if they feel they've made the wrong call, that becomes the conduit to moral injury. So that's certainly an issue that journalists are confronting right now. And then when you bring in all the online pressures that journalists are now subjected to, the hate that they receive, the nasty emails, that's just one further stress that becomes part of their working life. I recently wrote an op-ed piece for the Globe and Mail in Canada, and focusing on, you know, the well-being of journalists during the pandemic. And I was struck by the hostile responses that my piece elicited in the comments. You know, people are angry at journalists. They are not sympathetic to journalists. Now, I realize that the people who write in don't represent the general public. They represent a group who writes into, the editor. But I was just struck by the level of anger that a piece like this elicited. So, my answer to the question is you face multiple pressures right now, multiple stressors. And in response to that, potentially, it's going to affect you emotionally in terms of anxiety, depression, sleeplessness, general psychological distress. So we're trying to collect some data right now to help us answer this question. But I would not be surprised if this turned out to be a very difficult situation for journalists to deal with.
I mean, I'm going to go to a question from Daniel Pinheiros, a journalist from Brazil, who's had very direct experience of this kind of attack from the public. And she asked, journalists are now cursed, attacked, sometimes beaten when doing their work. Media organizations still don't know how to deal with this. And reporters end up feeling adrift and unprotected. How can you cope being mentally healthy and find forces to keep doing your job when all we're getting now feels like a daily slap in our faces?
Yeah. So my first point is this, news organizations should support journalists. I believe they have a moral responsibility to do so. I think if the expectation of news organizations that journalists have to go out there and endure these kind of stresses, then the news organization has a moral responsibility to support you and to help you, to make sure that you're physically safe and to provide the necessary counseling to you should you need it. I realize that lots of news organizations still do not do that, but that doesn't get them off the hook. I mean, there's a moral responsibility that news organizations do this. Waiting around for your organization to do it, of course, is not the way to go over here. So you've got to look after your own emotional health. And the point that I put across in all my talks that I've given on the pandemic is that you need to have your moments of respite. There was a letter to the editor of the New Yorker recently in which a very wise woman wrote in, addressing the question of the pandemic, how do we keep ourselves well? And she spoke about respite as a form of resilience. And I think that's absolutely profound. It's simple but profound. Respite as a form of resilience. You have to have your moments of respite. You've got to be able to step back from your work and devote time to yourself, to relax. Whether it's going for a walk, exercising, time with your family over a slow-paced meal, some reading unrelated to the pandemic, listening to music, whatever works for you. You've got to build that into your daily routine. It's so important that you do that. The pressures of your work are enormous. You can't spend all your waking hours focusing on the pandemic and all the pressures that come with it. Same thing, you've got to be able to step back from the hate mail that you might get, etc. So you have to have your moments of respite. And this, I think, will sustain you. Staying with the pandemic, we know the story's got a long way to run. It's not going to end soon. Many of us have been in lockdown for months now. So you've got to look after your emotional endurance. You've got to protect your capital of emotional resources. You can't use them up by focusing on things that you can't control. So step back, focus on yourself. Don't feel guilty in doing so. You all have a tremendous work ethic in which sometimes the job comes first. My message to you is, no, you need to come first right now. Yes, do your work and work hard, but devote time for your own mental well-being. It's so necessary that you do that now.
Absolutely, thank you. Related to that question almost for news managers, and this is from Jarkko in Finland. And people have different ability to deal with stress. And so when you're an editor and you've got to decide which journalists you send to a crisis area, how should newsrooms and editors evaluate each person's individual capability to deal with the stressful situation? And what kind of preemptive measures can be used in newsrooms to build resilience? You mentioned respite, but is there other ways?
I mean, that's a great question. And that's a very difficult question to answer. It's a politically weighted question as well, because I think you have to be really careful about self-selection, saying, oh, we think that, you've got the chops and you can go and do it, but someone else can't. And I think you have to be really careful about that, because you're going to get locked up in human rights issues and things that will become very uncomfortable to deal with. So I think, number one, news organizations need to be aware of what we're talking about. They need to be educated. There's no substitute for good education. There should be seminars and discussions within newsrooms on this topic, what we're talking about now. You need to educate managers and you have to educate news organizations about good emotional health. That's the first step. I believe the educated individual is much better equipped to deal with what we're discussing over here. I was struck 20 years back when I started to do this work, and I was interviewing great journalists, journalists who had built tremendous careers. I was struck by the level of psychological naivete. You know, they just hadn't grasped the psychological consequences of working in war zones. They just, you know, surprisingly hadn't put two and two together to realize that if this is going to define your career, if working in dangerous places defines your career, then in theory, you're going to be at risk for these conditions that we spoke about. There just really hadn't been a discussion about it or an awareness. And so I think education is pivotal, because this is how you break through that. People become aware that this is such an important topic. You know, emotional difficulties, depression, PTSD will bring you down as hard as a broken leg or a gunshot wound. These can be incapacitating conditions. Speak to people who've sustained this. Just look at Fergal Keane, the great British journalist, Irish journalist, who recently spoke about PTSD and the fact that he's no longer going into war zones in dangerous places because of his PTSD. And this is a great journalist who's had a decades-long career in dangerous places. So these kind of conditions can't be dismissed. So education is so important. Coming back to the original question, I think you're on very slippery slopes when you start self-selecting people for these kinds of jobs. I think the first criteria should be, how good are you as a journalist? You know, what's your ability as a journalist? That should be the defining characteristic over here. And that should determine who does what. And then I think the journalists should also have a say in it, you know, whether they want to do this or not. I think in the old days, journalists were too scared to speak up because they were worried, like my first patient, that if they told someone they were feeling unwell, their career would be over. You can't have an attitude like that. That's punitive. That becomes a human rights issue when news organizations behave like that. So you have to be so careful of that. So I still think the primary factor that will determine what a journalist does will be their ability. But news organizations have a moral responsibility to support the journalist in this kind of work.
That leads very nicely to the next question from Dorothy Byrne, who was head of news at Channel 4. So she's used to dealing with kind of a large newsroom of journalists. And she's saying, do you have any thoughts about how a line manager can raise with a journalist their apparent heavy drinking or unstable behavior? You know, if you see things, how do you start?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think, you know, what one does in a situation like that is, you know, take the person aside, you know, obviously ensuring that there's confidentiality, and just to let the journalist know, we're concerned about you. We think this is an issue. This is something that we take very seriously. We're here to support you. At the same time, you can acknowledge you're a great journalist, you're doing tremendous work, but we want you to remain well. We have within our news organization therapists. We have a mechanism in place to address something like this, and you can encourage a person to use it that way. It becomes very, very difficult to mandate this kind of therapy. I think, you know, journalists have to take some responsibility themselves for their own health. You know, we can't force people into therapy. It's just not possible to do that. You know, someone who feels that they're being forced into seeing a therapist will go unwillingly, and that's not going to be a good start to the kind of help that they need. And so just letting a person know that this is important, that they need to look after their emotional health, telling them that there's a mechanism here for you to receive that kind of assistance. I think that's the first step. If they refuse, it becomes much more problematic, because I do believe you can't force this, you can't mandate it.
Thank you. I mean,
by the way, I do have a funny story to tell you once, and this with in strict confidence. I was once asked to do a consult on exactly this question. A news organization was very concerned about a journalist who was drinking excessively, and they asked whether I could speak to the journalist, and they offered to fly me to the country where this was, you know, taking place. And so they flew me to meet the journalist, and the man arrived with a piece of paper, and I said, "What's that?" He says, "These are my liver function tests, and look, they're normal." And so, you know, you really started off with a really defensive approach to this problem. You know, my liver's fine, so why should I be speaking to you about my heavy drinking? And so these can present all sorts of challenges, but I think just letting the person know that this is a very important topic is the first step.
Thank you. Thank you. That's thank you. Well, amazing that they spent the resources to fly you over. Both worrying and heartening. I have a question from Kate Bartlett, who's our journalist, who's based in normally based in South Africa, and she's asking about the kind of hierarchy of suffering, because I think she's saying how can I have PTSD when I voluntarily went to report on child soldiers in the Congo? I'm not the one traumatized, they are traumatized. And this is different if you are a Mexican journalist reporting on your own country's drug wars, you're going to escape. But for the foreign correspondents flying in, why do, is this valid? Yeah.
That's an excellent question. It really is. And I hear it all the time. You have to be careful of what we call here a cognitive distortion, a cognitive trap. You're quite right that the people you report on have much greater trauma than the journalist who is observing it. There is no equivalent. We're not speaking about an equivalent over here. The individuals who have lost everything through war, who've lost relatives, who've lost their homes, their livelihood, etc., absolutely, their level of trauma is way beyond anything that a journalist is going to witness. At the same time, witnessing these things, being exposed to them, is not an inconsequential event. And you have to be careful of this cognitive trap in which you say, well, the suffering of other people is so much greater than what I've witnessed. What right do I have to complain? My example from a physical illness perspective is this. If you break a leg and you go into an emergency room and the woman in the bed next to you has broken 2 legs and an arm, you get up and hobble out? Of course you don't. You wait to get treated. And it's the same thing with emotional trauma. If you've been exposed to this kind of work, the majority of journalists are going to be okay. I've spoken a lot about trauma. I mean, the majority of journalists are okay with this, but there's going to be a minority who are not. And that's the group that needs assistance. And you don't want that group to have this sense of, well, if what I've been witnessing is so much worse than my own personal trauma, I really can't complain, because that basically shuts them up. It stops them speaking about how they're feeling. And they find themselves stuck in this trap, which is one of cognitive distortion. So you have to be aware of that. It's a great question. It comes up all the time. And my message to journalists is this: there is no equivalent, but it doesn't negate what you're feeling. It doesn't negate your own emotions.
Thanks, Kate. Thank you, Kate. I hope that answers the point. You talked about self-censorship. You touched on this lightly when you talked about Mexican journalists saying that they, at certain point, and it's a very logical response in many ways. You don't want to harm your family, so you stop doing the thing that people are going to tell you will harm your family. And Marco Pastomer has a related question on PTSD, which has any of your research touched on how post-traumatic stress disorder affects the coverage of news? So once they have suffered this, does this affect their output?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's one that I would love to address. It's very difficult to do that because I'm a psychiatrist. I can judge someone's mental state, their emotional state. I can't judge the quality of their work. I would need a journalist or a news organization to judge that. In theory, it should, because when you look at the way these disorders are defined, what the American Psychiatric Association does, it lists the symptoms, like I did for you, and then there comes a little clause, which is there for all mental illness, which says that the symptoms cause intense personal distress, and or interfere with their relationships, and or the ability to work. So implicit in all of this is an understanding that the significant mental illnesses can affect a person's ability to work. And so, yes, I think it's something that needs to be looked at. It would be a difficult study to do, but I think it's possible to do it. It's quite hard to get a sample together and do it. But I've always thought that this was one study that I would like to do, because it's one thing to have symptoms out there collected. It's another to have a look at what are the consequences of those symptoms. That's the critical variable over here. We know that it can play havoc with the personal life, that it can bring a person down very hard emotionally, and it can cause intense personal suffering. But how does that play out in terms of their quality of work? We haven't yet done a study to look at that. My prediction is it will affect their ability to work, but we don't know that empirically yet. So it's a great question.
And I'm not aware that there has been a study done.
No, there isn't one. No, there isn't one. Yeah.
One other thing about the pandemic right now is this kind of perfect storm of all the pressures you talk about, a kind of ever-moving front line, plus the kind of economic crisis in journalism. We're in an era of unprecedented layoffs, redundancies, closures. And so a question from Kathy English, which is, do you think that the current economic difficulties and the uncertainty that brings is also contributing to the stress journalists are experiencing?
It does.
And have you factored that in your research, the kind of economic uncertainty of journalism?
It is, Hannah Storm and I did a study a few years back looking at journalists covering the refugee crisis in Europe. And in fact, it was that study that flagged moral injury as the big issue, more than PTSD, more than depression, moral injury. But one of the questions that we asked was exactly this: what about the current economic state in journalism? And this emerged as a very significant issue, that journalists felt that they were being asked to do more for less, that the financial question was hindering their ability to work to a degree. And so, yes, I think the economics of it all is very much part of the picture, and adding to what journalists perceive, and that's important, what journalists perceive as a more stressful situation for them.
And thank you for that. And this is sort of like a question from Terry Harrell, which is the role of mourning, which again is something that journalists and frontline workers and key workers are having to deal with, which is how do you keep working if COVID-19 has directly affected you? You've had a family member pass away. Yeah. How do you deal with this, cope and work, while also trying to manage the harassment, the physical fear of getting sick, the state of journalism, and mourning when there doesn't seem to be time or space to mourn in the usual way at the moment? Yeah,
once again, such a good question. And it's very, very difficult. I'll tell you, my clinical work, it's been the biggest challenge that I've had to deal with patients, because I have had patients who have lost a loved one and who have been deprived the rituals of mourning. Those rituals, irrespective of what your religion is, those rituals have been developed over centuries to help with the mourning process. We need those rituals. They help us through this most difficult time. When you have a look at negative life events, there is a hierarchy. Top of the pile of negative life events is death of a loved one. And so, to endure that is hard enough. To be deprived of the rituals of mourning makes it much, much more difficult. So, if you're a child and you weren't at the bedside when your parent died, that adds a whole layer of complexity to what you feel. The guilt, a sense of moral injury, compounding your bereavement. It becomes such a difficult and painful question for people to deal with, and becomes very challenging in terms of therapy. I've worked with journalists who have been in one country and whose parent in a different country came down with the pandemic. And because there were restrictions on flying, they couldn't fly home to be with the family. They were not just separated from, the immediate relatives, they were separated geographically from everything, and were just stuck in a country far from home, having to mourn alone, away from extended relatives, etc. Enormously painful and difficult for the journalists to experience this. And this is another order of magnitude in terms of what some people are having to go through now. And you're right, this is what makes a pandemic such a difficult thing to deal with.
A few people have asked about resources and support. What we'll do, everybody who's registered here will get a follow-up email, and we'll send around some links to some sources of support for journalists and academics over mental health resources as well. Thank you. A few more questions, and then I'll just go. One from Howard Tumber, who says hello. But in your research, do the journalists you talk to self-diagnose, or do you diagnose them as a psychiatrist or as a researcher?
Right, yeah. Self-diagnosis is a very tricky business. Yes, people do, not just journalists, everybody self-diagnoses. And, I think, the armchair psychiatrist is a tricky thing to deal with. It's understandable that people self-diagnose, and because you have access to so much online material, some people go online and they start reading things and they feel it applies to them. The bottom line is it's impossible for you to be objective about yourself. You just can't do it. No one can be objective about themselves, journalists, psychiatrists, etc. And so be aware of the potential trap with something like this. You can arrive at a diagnosis that's not correct. You can misattribute symptoms, you can make a mistake, and then become convinced that this is indeed what I've got. And then you go doctor shopping to find some kind of confirmation that this is what you have. So rather than resort to self-diagnosis, my advice would be reach out to someone who's going to be objective, who's not connected to you emotionally, who's been trained to do this, and see where you go. You may be pleasantly surprised as well. I have many people come to me feeling that they've got a particular disorder, and I'm able to reassure them that they have not. I think in terms of the pandemic right now, we recognize that the prevailing emotion is one of anxiety. And I think it's entirely normal that people are feeling anxious from time to time now. Indeed, I don't think there's a person who has not felt a degree of anxiety or uncertainty or a bit of emotional discombobulation since the pandemic started. That's an entirely normal emotion. It's an understandable reaction to these unnatural events. The challenge from a clinical perspective is to determine when does that anxiety translate into something that requires therapy, that requires help. And for me, the two warning signs are, if your emotional life, your emotional symptoms are interfering with your ability to work, or if they're spilling over into your private life and your relationships are fraying, those are two triggers that suggest you should reach out for therapy. But some transient anxiety from time to time right now, I think is entirely appropriate and normal.
And a quick question is, do you have any clues about eating disorders amongst journalists? Is that something you've encountered?
No, I haven't come across that. I'm sure it would be, because it's not that uncommon in the general population, although you probably do know that eating disorders are much more prevalent in Western societies, where we have a completely different body image compared to other societies. So there's a very strong cultural nuance to eating disorders, but I have not come across it amongst journalists. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. And one final question from me, just about, is there any difference in your research between the way freelancers experience these symptoms and the support they get compared to ones who work for the larger newsrooms?
Right. So the symptoms are the same, but we have good data to show that freelancers will have more symptoms, not just of emotional difficulties, but of physical illness as well. So, their rates of hypertension, for example, or diabetes appear to be higher in freelancers, understandably, because they don't have access to the kind of medical care that other journalists have. So I think there is a qualitative difference between freelance journalists and their colleagues who have contracts.
Wow, that's extraordinary. And that's something that to bear in mind. There are more and more freelancers having to work in more and more difficult conditions, and have to make sure that there is also support available, but also an awareness as a news editor that if you hire a freelance, you've also got some responsibilities towards their well-being. I think on that note, I'm going to wind it up, because thank you everybody for your openness and your open questions. So Professor Feinstein, it's been possibly the most important topic we've discussed this term so far. So thank you so much for your time and for your input, both today, but also over the decades. It's, as you said, there's been very few people looking at this topic, and we're very glad you picked up the mantle 20 years ago and stayed with it.
Thank you
for your time. Thank you, everybody.
Good. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.